going to see John Emanuel now. He is one among many northern artists who have made their way down here. Of course, Barbara Hepworth was from Yorkshire. John himself is from Cumbria. He was a sign writer in Barrow, which stood him in good stead. His work is very sculptural. He likes to paint the figure in terms of landscape, so he associates the anatomy with hills and inclines and caves and so on. And he uses built-up collage and thick paint to get that kind of solid tactility. I've always thought that you're an instinctive painter rather than an intellectual painter, if you like. You do have that kind of tactile, earthy, even sculptural approach to the figure that you paint. Yeah. Very physical approach, often using collage and materials mixed in with the paint to get that kind of...
a lot of mixed media.
A lot of mixed media. Now, did that style kind of develop in St Ives in response to, you know, the landscape you're in response to Lanyon, who also saw the figure in terms of landscape? Or
I think it has done, because I've been in St Ives now at a studio in St Ives anyway for 25 years, and when I first started I mixed my paint with stand oil, powder and stand oil,
which Lanyon did,
and also, I mean, and so there wasn't much scope for mixed media work, but gradually, as it's gone from just a few canvases a year to when I was showing with Montpellier every 2.5 or 3 years, more work is needed, and so when I started painting full time, the mixed media work came in, because it gives me much more scope rather than just working on one surface, one kind of, I can work on paper, primed paper, sort of like canvases, board. You've got much more scope with mixed media in that sense than just oil on canvas, plain oil.
When you were up in the north, I believe you were a sign writer. Did that kind of, you know, craft have an effect on your approach to paint and materials? And
well, the thing was that decorating more than sign writing. I did more sign writing down here. In the north it was decorating, and it was quality work with hand block wallpapers, a lot of graining, light oak, dark oak, bird's eye maple, mahogany.
This must have had an effect on your approach to painting in the fine art context.
I think it has, in a love of materials for a start, because the hand block wallpapers and the flock wallpapers were nice things to handle. And so when it came to painting, gouache, watercolours and everything, I loved the materials, and so the materials, what I really think is, you know, the materials are only a means to an end of the finished painting, aren't they? They're not, the technique is not, whereas in craft work, technique means much more, I think, in that sense. And so yes, that's quite right. It does give you a love of materials, but maybe that's what happens. I don't know if that happens in college when people go to art schools or not, because I didn't have any formal training.
I mean, that lack of a formal training, I would suggest, is possibly even an advantage to you. I mean, Francis Bacon was never trained, and he's what must be the most successful British painter of the 20th century, probably, and I mean, he almost made a virtue of the fact that he'd never had an academic fine art training.
I think you learn as you go, don't you? And people you meet has a sort of a big influence on you, and gradually you find your way until you have a vision of where you think your work is going, and I think that's the important thing. It's not an intellectual concept as such in words, it's more of a visual thing, but you have a vision, you have an idea of where you want to go, and mine moves around with the figure. standing figure, reclining figure, figure in landscape, figure in landscape, and so that's my vision. It's a very narrow one, but it.
I think the narrow vision is usually a source of strength. I mean, Morandi just painted bottles all his life, and he's now seen as one of the greatest still life painters of all time. So I think that restricted vision, as you say, is actually an inadvertent strength. But I was interested in what you said about the reclining figure or the standing or crouched figure. To me, in the simplest terms, a standing figure is sort of architectural, almost like a caryatid.
Yeah.
You know, whereas the reclining figure is obviously landscape invoking.
Yeah.
And I noticed in some of your drawings with the upright figure or the crouched figure, they dominate the composition, they define the composition, the sheet of paper.
Yeah.
They, rather like Roger Hilton used his figure drawings to sort of create a composition just out of the outline of the figure, the anatomy of the figure became the composition itself. Yeah. Whereas obviously with the reclining figure, you can read it in terms of hills and valleys and.
That's right. Yeah. The one thing that is always with the figure on its own is the subjective side of the figure, i.e. you draw someone who you're with as to an objective where you have a model or someone to draw, something to draw. So this subjective objective thing I've always followed as well, and I think the earlier paintings show a very subjective side, and later on they will become objective, i.e. figure and landscape.
John, in this particular work on paper, reminds me a little bit of William Scott, but it's that kind of squeezing the anatomy of the figure into the overall sheet, so that there's a structural quality to the figure itself. It's very, very strong compositionally.
Yeah, yeah.
And, you know, just an example of what I was saying earlier about, you know, the figure kind of almost like a caryatid, you know, functioning as a sort of structure in its own right.
Well, it is. I mean, it's a funny sort of pose, that, and I don't think it was a small drawing done from life, but the leg wasn't as upright at that. It was just sort of like relaxed, just like a leg over an arm, a leg up really, and I've put that up there to give it that kind of structure and those heavy black lines, and to make it sort of like a solid piece, a really strong piece of work really in that sense. The actual, it's oil on paper, and I used quite a large brush and just sort of mixed up a thin glaze and brushed it in, and then that was it. Then just ran the white in. That was it, finished.
Now with this one, which is a sort of black and white, charcoal on paper, again, you've got that strong sculptural quality and the positive negative.
The idea of these were night figures, sort of like not particularly asleep, but just about a figure in the night, and that's all it is.
I don't see necessarily a great deal of erotic content in the work. It's almost more like a sort of classical.
Well, this is where the subjective objective comes in. In the more subjective ones, the sensuality comes through, but these are not about that. These are more or less using the female form, if you like, as a structure, as a kind of structure, and so the sensuality there doesn't enter into it. There has to be some, of course, in it, but it's not the way of doing it. And these kind of figures are the ones that led on to the Figure and Skyline series, where this becomes more amorphous, and then you put a skyline in.
And then this one here, the girl in a striped T-shirt.
Yeah,
Reminds me a little bit of Bernard Buffet.
Yeah, this is interesting because I do love the German Blue Rider Group work, and their postcards which they sent to each other, and this I think has that kind of a feel to it in a way. But it was
and also the face as a mask.
In a way, yes, yeah, but again, it was the charcoal. The drawing was done from life in this one, as the second one was, and then I used something. It was called a water-based oil paint. It was a contradiction in terms.
I've heard about that. Yeah.
And so this water-based, you can use it like a gouache, like a watercolour, and it's got its own medium, which is. You can use with it, and that was how this one came about. It's a charcoal drawing really, which has got a thin glaze, a thin wash over it, and that was done very quickly. The drawing was done from life and the paint was put on very quickly and then left as mutos.
So essentially
a sketch.
A tinted drawing.
A tinted drawing in that sense, yeah.
And therefore the colour that's registered in the drawing therefore has a kind of iconic significance, or it has an emotional charge.
That's right, yeah.
You know, because it's just two colours or whatever.
But there's 25 years difference in this is on the wall because it got wet when the windows blew in, or it got crumpled, and I've stretched it out and it's put on the wall. This one is about 12 months old. So there is a nice link coming through where it links up as I sort of developed and worked it through.
John, I'm rather interested in these sculptural bas-relief figures you've modelled.
Yes. They started some years ago when the maintenance man here had some slates coming off the roof, and I'd already done these with clay and had them fired, and he had all this cement mixed up, so I covered them with cement. And then I thought, well, I do a series of classical heads using gold leaf, so I thought, well, what I would do is I'd paint the heads red and then put the gold leaf on, which is traditional in that sense. So that's how the gold heads came about. And then the drape, in Renaissance paintings they would dip drapes into clay slip, put whatever they want in, and then spend hours drawing it. And this, I dipped this material in cement and just made the drape. The ideas just evolved really easily, really.
But
they're a bit of fun. Well, not fun. Well, yeah, they are a bit of fun.
Surely that sort of quirky, spontaneous approach is typical of the St Ives school, isn't it?
It is.
Just that Cornish, turning your hand to whatever available, and turning it into some magic like Picasso. You know, just turning a common found.
Yeah. It was, but when Patrick Hughes, he suggested I make these figures and put them in an area, put them in an enclosed space and draw them. That was how the figures came about. And that was in the late 70s, very early 80s, and they've been hanging about for a long time. So it was quite a few years later when Nicky was doing the roof with the cement that the idea to cover them with cement did. So that's how the figures came around in the first place.
Yeah, and it's an extension of the flat sheet of paper or canvas.
Yes, it is.
It's exploring the figure in that sort of bas-relief, slightly 3D dimension.
Yes, it is, yeah.